Welcome to AP Psychology. We're going to have a great year. This year, we start off with history and approaches. But before we can start talking about the different aspects of psychology, we have to figure out what psychology is. So, psychology. It is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes, and it's made up of two components, behavior and mental processes. Now, behavior is your outward or your overt actions and reactions. So if I make you upset, your behavior is punching me in the face. While your mental processes are invert, covert activity of our minds. Now, I'm your teacher, so you can't punch me in the face. So all of your thoughts about punching me in the face are ways to upset me or get back with me under mental warfare. That would all be under your mental processes. So what is psychology? It's a science. What we're trying to do is prevent possible biases from leading to faulty observations. We want to make sure that what we are studying is clear, concise, and correct. The interesting thing about psychology is that it's as much of a science class as it is a history or humanities. So this year you'll be learning a lot about biology, you'll be learning a lot about experiments, you'll be learning a lot about formations of experiments, lab reports, all those different types of things we'll be discussing in depth throughout the year. Now, we are trying to be as precise and as careful with our measurement because every data point matters in order to see if there's a correlation to our hypothesis. So, psychology has four major goals. Description, so describe what is happening, what are we seeing, what's occurring. Explanation, why is it happening? What are we trying to figure out here? We always have a theory in place that is the baseline for our experiment. Now, a lot of times experiments go off track, so we predicted a certain type of behavior, we have a theory about a certain type of behavior, but with all of the experiments we do, we find out the behavior doesn't quite have a strong tie. We also have predictions, will it happen again, and control. How can it be changed? How can we manipulate, or is it manipulatable? Most of the time it really is. Now, history of the field has started in the early 1800s. Now, the idea of thinking about human thoughts is nothing new. The Greeks, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, all of those incredible Greek philosophers have been studying the mind and studying thoughts of the mind. It's only until about the 1800s that we start seeing scientific approach to analyzing the parts of the brain and the mind and all those components. Now, philosophers, like I said, have been asking these questions. Physiologists have been studying the brain. Now we're going to start seeing them kind of work together. Now, the first major theory of psychology is structuralism. Now, it focused on the structure or basic elements of the mind. This was started by William Wundt. This is the first branch of psychology. William Wundt is the father of psychology. It started in 1879 in Germany. And his major tool for looking at the human's thought process is introspection. And it's about examining one's thoughts and mental activities. So really thinking about thinking is introspection. Now, William Wundt is going to teach Edward Titchener. Now, Titchener is going to bring this to the Americas. Now, the Americas have been behind in a lot of things in science and history for a very long time, mostly because we're a new country relative to most. So what we're going to see that William Titchener is going to bring this back to the Americas very, very early on, which is why psychology thrives here in the United States, and the United States is actually the largest purveyor of new science and new exploration in the field, which is pretty cool. Now, Margaret Washburn is going to be the first female involved in psychology, and she is going to be the first woman to earn a PhD, and she is a student of Titchener. So psychology starts with William Wundt looking at structuralism. Under structuralism, we use introspection, which is analyzing your own thoughts. Wundt teaches Titchener. Titchener teaches Washburn, and she's the first female PhD. Now, after structuralism takes off and is incredibly successful, we start seeing functionalism. Now, functionalism is going to grow out of structuralism but become its own separate identity. Now, functionalism is how the mind allows people to adapt, live, work, and play. Unlike structuralism, the people who follow functionalism want to know how the mind allows you to work instead of parts of the brain, which is structuralism, how it works. Functionalism want to know how the brain adapts. Now, William James is going to be our original functionalist, and he's going to influence psychology, evolutionary psychology, and industrial and in organizational psychology. Structuralism is going to start everything, but functionalism is where we see all of these different approaches come from. Now, under functionalism, we have Gestalt psychology. Now, Gestalt is good figure psychology, or I like to think of it as the sum of the parts. Now, it's going to start with a gentleman called Wertheimer, who studied sensation and perception, and it's all about cognitive psychology. Now, Gestalt is going to be a very difficult component that we'll be dealing with all year. Every year, every group I've ever taught, and we see this across all schools, people have a hard time with psychology, with Gestalt psychology. We're going to study it mostly in sensation and perception. It does come up a little bit later, but when you think Gestalt psychology, think of sensation perception, and we'll get further into that here. Now, psychoanalysis is going to come up next, and that is based on the work of Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud is probably something you've heard already. Well, you should have heard his name already. He is a very prominent thinker in the late 19th century. He is a foundation of psychology, has some incredible ideas and some creepy thoughts, and he's a huge cornerstone of the course. Now, Sigmund Freud is going to start psychoanalysis, and he believed that that there's an unconscious or unaware part of the mind that we either push, repress, or threaten us, or gives us urges and desires. So he believes that in our mind we have untapped resources or untapped thoughts that share. Now, he believed that these are repressed urges and trying to surface, which create nervous disorders. So he believed that our unconscious thoughts were rolling around inside of our bodies and causing tension and causing fear and causing all these other things, which is why people have physical disorders. Now, Freud is going to stress the importance of early childhood experiences, that essentially that if you grew up or had a rough childhood, you're going to have a very rough adulthood. So psychoanalysis is going to come out of functionalism as well as behaviorism. Now, behaviorism is going to be one we discuss throughout the year. A lot of my favorite experiments throughout the year are behaviorists. Now, behaviorism is a scientific study of behavior that focuses on observable behavior only. So if you declare yourself a behaviorist, you don't care why people make those choices, you just care that they do. Okay, it's kind of like if your girlfriend cheats on you. You don't care why she cheated on you, you only care that she actually cheated on you. Okay, now some of you care, why did you cheat on me? Oh my God, is it because I don't love you enough? All those types of things, then you are not a behaviorist. Now, everything in behaviorism must be directly seen and measured. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. This is probably the most scientific of all of our approaches. Now, it's going to be started by John B. Watson. He's going to lead one of our most interesting experiments. And also, he's going to be inspired by Ivan Pavlov. Now, these names mean nothing to you at the moment. However, these are huge names that you will know backwards and forwards coming up. Now, Watson is going to believe that phobias are learned. Like if you have a fear of spiders, a fear of snakes, anything like that they are in fact learned. And we're going to see this in the very famous experiment of little Albert, which you'll be seeing here in a couple weeks. Now, those are your major original approaches. Now, as psychology has gone ahead and advanced and increased in popularity with a lot more research and science and theories, we enter the modern perspectives. Now, the modern perspectives take the older perspectives and are a little bit more focused and a little bit more specific. Now, the first one is the modern psychodynamic perspective, which is a modern version of psychoanalysis. Now, psychoanalysis is actually not really studied that much anymore. People feel that Freud is a little too extreme and his ideas are a little unnerving at times. We'll get to that later. So psychodynamic came out of that, and it's more focused on the development of a sense of self and discovery of motivations. It's more about how your unconscious affects your conscious behavior in a much more positive way than a very dark and dreary perspective that Sigmund Freud was putting out there before. And then it's looking at sexual motivations, what inspires us, because keep in mind, when we talk about psychology, everything is based on food, sex, and water. Those three major components in psychodynamics, analyzing what motivates us the most. Our next modern perspective is behavioral perspective, and this is going to be honed in on by B.F. Skinner, who's going to study operant conditioning and voluntary behavior. Now, when we think about behaviorism, it is a major component of the 20th century, and we're going to see a huge burst in that field. The reason is because science is so strong. When you have nice, strong, clean data to support your evidence, it makes it a very clean, clear makes it very strong, clean, and clear without anyone saying elsewhere. Now, Skinner is going to introduce the reinforcement in behaviorism, which we're going to see throughout education, throughout working environments, all over the place because of these men. Now, another modern perspective is the humanistic perspective. Now, the humanistic perspective believes that humans are more than their animal history. They believe that humans have a moral and intellectual advantages over all animals, and that we are, in fact, superior to every animal around. Humanists believe that people have free will and the freedom to choose their own destiny. Now, when we think about humanistic perspective, it's Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. We're going to discuss these guys at the end of first semester this year. Now, emphasize the human potential, the ability for a person to become the best person he or she could be. One of the major tools of humanistic perspective is self-actualization. Now, when we think about the humanistic perspective, it's just about self-improvement is the best way to kind of think of it. Now, another modern perspective is the cognitive perspective, which focuses on memory, intelligence, perception, problem solving, and learning. This is all about that if we sit and study how to think, why we think that way, we can essentially understand psychology, which we're going to see a lot coming up here in the memory component, of course, and the sociocultural, which focuses on the relationship between social behavior and culture, that your culture dictates your behavior and your behavior is dictated by your culture. So the way you act, the way you interact with other people is dictated by the family you grew up in, the culture you grew up in, all those types of things. Now, another modern perspective is your biopsychological perspective. Now, this looks at how your body's chemistry interacts or interferes with the activity of your brain and your decision making and all that stuff. So now the biological perspective looks at how human and animal behaviors are very similar. So if you fall in love with Susie, it's because your hormones, your little physical body chemistry aligns with that person. That's what biological perspective is all about. Now, the evolutionary perspective is going to focus on the biological basis of universal characteristics, essentially based on Darwin, of course, that your personality, your behavior, your interactions with others are all based on characteristics of previous generations and what has worked out well for them. It's all about reproduction. It's all about food, sex, and reproduction. How can we advance our position in order to find the best mate, which is your evolutionary perspective. Now, when we think about evolutionary, it's all about trying to survive. Now, when we talk about psychologists, it's important to know that there are different types of psychological professionals out there, and every single one typically falls in one category. However, we are now seeing a new movement in psychology where they say, oh, I'm every perspective, but we'll get to that later. Now, the first type of psychological professional is called a psychiatrist. They're a medical doctor who specializes in diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders. A psychiatrist are able to prescribe medication, which is very unique. They have an MD, not just a PhD. An MD means a medical doctorate, which means they are allowed to prescribe medicine. The next is a psychoanalyst. They are a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Now, a psychologist is just someone who has studied psychology and has a PhD in it. They can treat, they can do therapy sessions, but they cannot prescribe medicine. A psychoanalyst is someone who has studied the theories of Freud and his method of psychoanalysis, which we'll get into much deeper here later. It is not a dying field, but very few people go after this specialist degree. It takes a lot of schooling and a lot of time in order to earn this degree. One of the most prestigious universities that are still offering this degree is Boston University, actually. Now, the next type of psychological professional is a psychiatric social worker. It's a social worker who has training in psychology. Most of your school psychologists on campus, here at Plant, here in the Hillsborough County, typically are a psychiatric social worker, which means they're looking at environmental conditions, mental disorders, poverty, overcrowding, stress, drug abuse, all those different types of things typically fall under them. Now, what is a psychologist? We kind of referenced it earlier. It is a professional with an academic degree and specialized training in one or more areas of psychology. They have a PhD, which means they can practice by treating and hosting therapy sessions and doing those types of things, but they cannot prescribe any type of medication except with a very special psychologist degree, but don't worry about that. Now, they can teach, they can do research, all those different types of things. A lot of the great inputs done by psychologists are clinical counseling, developmental and social as well. So they're the ones actually out there treating, while your psychiatrists are out there medicating typically. Now, when you think of psychology, you have to think of it in different sections. Now, a lot of psychologists work at universities and four-year colleges. So if you're thinking about becoming a psychology major, most of your jobs are going to be found at university level. So that means you have to be really good because it takes a lot of intelligence and strong research in order to get those grants. Now, some of them, you'll see the largest next majority are going to be self-employed. Those are therapists. Those are people who go out into the field and help people, which is fantastic, which is what you typically think of when you think about psychologists. Now, if you look at the other pie chart, which is subfields of psychology, you're going to see the majority is going to be clinical. Now, when we talk about clinical, mostly we're dealing with research. Now, actually, a lot of money for research is going to drug testing, which does have some psychological-based component. However, you're going to see a lot of it is going to be done for actually advertising, which is pretty cool. So, I hope you've enjoyed your first week, and test on Friday. Have a great week, guys, and enjoy.